They said it at the kitchen table while a neighbor listened, smiling politely. My mother slid the statement across like a joke, my sister grinning beside her. The charge alert buzzed on my phone. I looked at the amount, then at their faces. No one apologized. No one asked. My father kept eating, nodding along. I didn't argue. I didn't explain the card was mine. I smiled and told them to enjoy the trip. The neighbor laughed, thinking it was generous. I stood there quietly, learning how easily theft becomes family business when silence makes it comfortable for everyone present. The kitchen had always been their stage. Decisions were announced there, not discussed. My parents sat on one side of the table, my sister on the other, the way it had been since we were kids. I stood near the counter, leaning back so I wouldn't block the light. When the charge notification came through, my mother glanced at my phone and smirked. She said I didn't need the money anyway. The neighbor laughed, unsure, then committed to it. Laughter makes things official. Authority in our family lived with whoever spoke first and loudest. That day, it was my mother. She had learned long ago that confidence could replace consent. My father backed her with silence. He always had. If something benefited my sister, he found a way to justify it. If it harmed me, he found a way to minimize it. They had lived in my house for 3 years by then. Rent-free. I paid the mortgage and taxes and repairs. They called it temporary. They said they were helping me by watching the place while I traveled for work. The truth was simpler. I had the credit. I had the savings. I had the patience. Those qualities made me useful. My sister's vacation had been discussed for months. Her dream. Her reward. The dates circled on calendars I didn't own. I was told about it in passing, like a weather update. I assumed they were paying for it. That assumption was my mistake. When I asked, carefully, how the charge ended up on my card, my mother waved a hand. She said families share. She said I would get points. My sister said she'd pay me back eventually. She said it lightly, like a promise made to air. My father nodded, already done with the conversation. I felt the familiar pull to smooth things over. To say it was fine. To adjust. That impulse had been trained. When I was younger, my savings covered school trips my sister forgot to budget for. When I got my first job, I paid bills quietly. When they needed help, I provided it without ceremony. It kept peace. It also erased boundaries. The neighbor finally excused herself. The room shrank. I waited for someone to say it had gone too far. No one did. My mother poured coffee. My sister talked about excursions. My father asked about luggage. The theft settled into routine. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. I opened the app and stared at the charge. I could have disputed it then. I didn't. I knew what would follow. Calls. Accusations. Tears framed as injury. I had played that scene before. It never ended well. Instead, I thought about the house. About the deed in my name. About the lease I'd never written. About how temporary arrangements become permanent when no one pushes back. I returned to the kitchen and smiled again. I told them to enjoy it. I said I hoped the sea was calm. They left a week later with suitcases and excitement. I waved from the doorway. I locked the door behind them and stood there longer than necessary, listening to the quiet. Something in me finally aligned. Silence was no longer agreement. It was preparation. The pattern had been building long before the charge. Money moved one direction in our family, and it wasn't subtle. When my sister overspent, it was framed as optimism. When I hesitated, it was framed as selfishness. My parents praised generosity, but only when it came from me. After I bought the house, my mother suggested they move in for a little while. My sister needed space. They needed stability. I needed to be understanding. I agreed because I always did. I told myself it was practical. I told myself it was temporary. Temporary stretched quietly, month by month, until it stopped having an end date. Repairs came up. A leak. An appliance. My father said it made sense for me to handle it since the house was mine. Groceries followed the same logic. Utilities. Internet. I paid and didn't itemize. I didn't want to be counted. I wanted to belong. When friends asked why I never stayed there, I said work kept me busy. I didn't mention that it felt strange to sleep in a house where I was treated like a guest. My room stayed neutral. My sister's preferences shaped the living space. Photos went up that didn't include me. The vacation charge wasn't a mistake. It was the moment the pattern stopped hiding. They didn't ask because they didn't expect refusal. They didn't apologize because they didn't see a problem. They saw access. In the days before they left, my mother made lists. Instructions. Reminders about mail and plants. She spoke as if nothing had shifted. My sister joked about souvenirs. My father asked me to check the water heater while they were gone. I said okay. I met with a realtor that same week. Quietly. I brought documents I already had. The process was straightforward. Ownership has clarity built into it. I scheduled showings around my work. I cleaned the house once, thoroughly, then stopped maintaining it like a favor. At the airport, my mother hugged me and said she'd missed me lately. I nodded. My sister waved with both hands. My father told me to be responsible. I watched them disappear past security and felt the weight lift. While they were at sea, unreachable, the house filled with strangers' footsteps. Offers came in. Paperwork moved. The transaction followed rules, not feelings. I signed where required. I answered questions directly. I did not explain myself to anyone who didn't need to know. The silence wasn't empty. It was productive. The boundary crossing happened when the escrow confirmed closing while the ship was still at sea. I read the email twice, then once more, steady. Funds scheduled. Keys to transfer. Occupancy ending. It was clean, legal, ordinary. I didn't send messages. I didn't warn them. I didn't celebrate. I forwarded the notice to a storage company and booked a small unit near my place. I boxed what was mine, labeled it, and left the rest untouched. The house was no longer a conversation. It was an address with a date. I stopped covering expenses that week. Utilities were set to end. The internet account moved. Automatic payments canceled. Each step required a click, not a speech. I slept well. 2 days later, the buyer's inspector walked through. He asked who lived there. I said family. He asked when they would vacate. I gave the date. He nodded and wrote it down. No one argued. I realized then how often I had mistaken permission for kindness. How often I had believed access equaled love. Standing in that empty kitchen, I felt the last thread of obligation loosen. The call logs began to stack the morning after closing. Missed calls, voicemails, messages sent out of order. Questions turned sharp, then pleading. I didn't listen. I read the transcripts once and archived them. The facts were already recorded elsewhere. I sent one message, brief. The sale had closed. The house was no longer available. Instructions for collecting personal items would follow. No commentary. No apology. I put the phone down and went to work. Begging ended there. So did borrowing. What remained was a line I would not step back over, even for blood. I kept my posture calm and my records tidy, trusting time and documents to speak without further explanation ever. They returned to shore and found service again. The calls multiplied. Messages arrived from unknown numbers. My sister wrote first, asking if this was a joke. My mother followed, then my father, each voice rising without hearing the others. None of them asked about the charge. They asked about the house. I didn't respond immediately. I waited until the moving company confirmed pickup times. I waited until the buyer confirmed possession. I waited until everything irreversible was done. Then I replied once, with the storage address and a window for access. I did not add context. The facts were enough. They accused me of betrayal. Of cruelty. Of humiliation. They said family doesn't do this. They said I had embarrassed them. I didn't correct the record. Their words exposed the assumption that my role was to absorb loss so theirs could continue. Extended family reached out cautiously. Some asked if there had been a misunderstanding. I said no. Others stopped calling. Silence sorted itself. Financially, things stabilized quickly. The credit card balance was paid off. Savings replenished. The knot I carried for years loosened. I noticed it first in small ways. My shoulders dropped. My sleep deepened. I stopped checking my phone for approval. I moved into a place that was mine alone. I bought a table and set it where light came in. I cooked meals without calculating who would take credit. I kept receipts for myself, not for proof. Months later, my sister asked if we could talk. I said maybe another time. My parents sent a holiday card with a neutral message. I placed it in a drawer. I didn't take revenge. I took responsibility. I stepped out of a system that required my silence to function. The sea passed. The house changed hands. The story ended where it should have. With clarity, dignity, and a future that no longer asked me to fund my own erasure.